Good evening, everybody. My name is Louise Bethlehem. It's a pleasure for me to offer some opening words on behalf of my co-organizers, Areej, Sabbagh-Khoury, Matan, Kaminer, and Revital, Madar, in the framework of this conference convened by Academia for Equality and entitled Concerning Palestine, Israel, Thinking with Achille Mbembe. In rhetoric, as opposed to narratology, the trope of metalepsis is sometimes used to designate present effect attributed to remote cause in a compressed chain of metaphorical reading, as Lanham puts it. I found metalepsis a useful frame through which to reflect on the origins of this conference, with reference to a series of polemics surrounding the Cameroonian-born historian and political philosopher Achille Mbembe in Germany earlier this year. I will not legitimate the allegations in various quarters concerning Mbembe's alleged anti-Semitism through recapitulating them. Instead, I want to signpost some itineraries of thought and political action that came into being, metaleptically, so to speak, in the wake of this public controversy. In the first place, I want to remind us of the open letter circulated at the initiative of my colleague Amos Goldberg and his partners in Germany and beyond, pointing to the definition of Mbembe as consistent with the weaponization of charges of anti-Semitism against critics and activists exerting their freedom of speech to protest Israel's violation of Palestinian rights. The letter generated considerable discussion in Germany, opening the debate in important ways to productive new directions. Over the last day or two, we've also seen the beginnings of a related initiative to challenge attempts to induce Facebook to adopt the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance's definition of anti-Semitism and to use it to police content published on its platform. In the second place, though, I want to contextualize tomorrow night's event, an event that was thought into being by Revital and so beautifully realized through the efforts of my fellow organizers within the framework of Academia for Equality, Matan and Areej. Together with our panelists and audience, we seek to channel critical impetus to bear not on the German public sphere, but elsewhere, as together we deepen analysis of key occurrences and dynamics with reference to the Nakba and its aftermath, the 1967 occupation of Palestinian territories, and the Israeli regime in general. We hope that these efforts will provide the occasion for multiple solidarities, the first of which is, of course, the opportunity to think with Achille Mbembe, that is to say, alongside him, in solidarity. Before I turn to what it might mean to think with Mbembe in a second sense, of how concepts originating from or in dialogue with his work might find application within the context that we've defined tonight, let me briefly foreground a different set of solidarities by focusing for a moment on Academia for Equality and offering some words of thanks. Academia for Equality is a membership organization of over 600 academics committed to the democratization of Israeli academia and society and to solidarity with oppressed people around the world. We are active on a number of fronts, including the fight against sexual harassment in academia and the struggles of academic workers against precarious labor conditions. The organization has stood in solidarity with Achille Mbembe from the outset and has marshaled its resources to support our initiative tonight. Our special thanks go to Yara Benger-Alaluf for the striking conference poster and to Aviva Shemesh for technical support this evening. To find out more about Academia for Equality, please visit our site, academiaforequality.com, where the 4 is the numeral, or our Facebook page. Now, for some of us working on issues related to Palestine-Israel, our intellectual engagement with the work of Achille Mbembe took his essay Necropolitics, published in English in 2003 in Public Culture, as its point of departure. At that point, Mbembe was already well known for his On the Post colony in French in 2000 and English in 2001, with its very provocative account of what he called the sensory life of power in Africa and the logic of, quote, mutual corruption and conviviality that binds rulers and subjects. In a new turn, the essay Necropolitics took Mbembe's abiding concern with, quote, the power to kill under colonialism, which he pointed out goes hand in hand with the power of degradation and violation. And he says, moreover, quote, always conceals itself behind the pantomime of right. So he took this thought to an encounter with a Foucauldian biopolitics. Mbembe sees Foucault's paradigm of biopolitics as insufficient in itself to explain what he calls contemporary forms of subjugation of life to the power of death. Rather, biopower, the state of exception, and the state of siege are posited as intersecting in necropolitical sovereignty, whose, quote, topographies of cruelty Mbembe elaborated with respect to the plantation, the colony, and the apartheid township or homeland. What Mbembe calls the late modern colonial occupation of Palestine is the site there of extended analysis, which, in retrospect, reads as prescient and as still generative despite the years that have passed since the first publication of this intervention. I'm going to leave our panelists to say more on this topic, and perhaps to invoke the presence of Frantz Fanon, whose concerns animate Achille Mbembe's work so centrally and who are residually present in the title of our conference. But let me observe instead that the recent juxtaposition of the original essay with writings that were collected in the 2016 volume Politique de l'Humanité as the Duke University Press volume Necropolitics bookends the discussion of Palestine in very interesting ways, drawing out the continuing trajectories of Mbembe's thought, also reflected in the recent translation of the volumes Critique of Black Reason, 2016, and Out of the Dark Night, Essays on Decolonization, 2020. This is an oeuvre that constantly renews itself, right up to the present moment. Our reflections on Palestine-Israel cannot, in fact, be disengaged from the temporality of this moment in which they are unfolding. In words that resonate deeply with the pandemic regimes in which we all find ourselves embedded, Mbembe recently reminded us that, quote, new mechanisms of domination are constantly emerging. Predation, draining, and extraction remain the rule, as does the recourse to brute force. But the new domination also operates implicitly through the proliferation of means of surveillance, the use of technological ingenuity, the practices that set each of us in competition with everybody else, and the revision of laws in order to extend capital's reach. The remarks were offered in response to Mbembe's latest work, Brutalisme, which came out in Paris in February and has reportedly become one of the most read books in the French-speaking world under lockdown. At the same time, Mbembe has recurrently been concerned to open up vistas for progressive and even utopian thought. I'm reminded of another intervention, The Universal Right to Breathe, also recently published. Here, he directs us to the resources of community, reminding us that, quote, the in common is based also on the possibility of sharing unconditionally, each time drawing from it something absolutely intrinsic, a thing uncountable, incalculable, priceless. It is my hope that as we share unconditionally here tonight, we will enter into the essentially relational dynamics that ground Mbembe's intellectual production. In conversation with David Theo Goldberg around the volume Critique of Black Reason, Mbembe has spoken of how the book confronts African American history from the perspective of the African continent. Thus, putting it in relation, he says, to other bodies, other fissures, and other intensities. I hope that going forward with our discussions here, we will somehow emulate the gesture, speaking to Achille Mbembe on Palestine, Israel, from the other side, as it were, from local emplacements in this region or from locales situated somewhere along the metonymic skeins of connection that emanate from it, so that we might allow his thought on Palestine, Israel to, quote again, speak differently out of its presumed ground. I think we're about ready to begin the first panel function, and then we'll call on you in sequence. In the interest of continuity and the constraints of the Zoom format, I'm now going to be introducing all speakers at once at the beginning of our first panel. So, our first panel is Police and the Urban. Nitzan Lebovic is Professor of History and the Actor Chair of Holocaust Studies and Ethical Values at Lehigh University in Pennsylvania. He received his BA in History and Theory of Literature from Tel Aviv University and his PhD from UCLA. He's the author of Philosophy of Life and Death, Ludwig Klages and the Rise of Nazi Biopolitics, as well as Zionism and Melancholy, The Short Life of Israel Zalta. Nitzan is co-editor of The Politics of Nihilism and of Catastrophes, A History and Theory of an Operative Concept, as well as of numerous special issues in Rethinking History, Zmanim, The New German Critique, Comparative Literature and Culture, and Political Theology. The title of his presentation is This Stifling Noonday, Necropolitics as a Theory of Untime. Lastly, Dr. Bruce Stanley is a specialist in international relations, Middle East cities, and political risks. He is currently an adjunct professor in international relations at Richmond, the American International University in London, where he teaches conflict resolution and politics of the Middle East. He has practiced widely as a consultant to the EU, USAID, and various NGO donors across the Middle East, and was country director for Ahmed East in the West Bank and Gaza, from where he supported training programs for Palestinian universities and civil society, taught at the Friends School in Ramallah, led study abroad programs for Earlham College to Palestine, Israel, and Jordan. He has taught at SOAS, the University of Exeter, Syracuse University, and for Queen's University, Canada. Bruce has published on issues of conflict resolution and social movements and urban resilience, and is currently writing a book on Middle East city networks. He continues to research issues of urban carcerality in the region, and his title tonight is Policing Palestinian Cities.
I hope you can all see both the slides and myself. Thank you very much for the organizers and for Academia Leshivion, Academy for Equality, for this wonderful opportunity to share a few thoughts with you. The paper, a short, very brief paper I'm going to talk about today, considers the spatial boundaries Mbembe is talking about in his work on necropolitics as a question of temporal control. Now, let me open with a joke and actually take it from here. So you probably know the old joke about the two patients planning to escape a mental institute. The first patient tells the other he should check the wall. If it's high, they'll dig under it. If it's low, they'll jump over it. After a few minutes, the other patient returns and reports that the escape is impossible. Why, the first patient asks. Because there is no wall, the second answers. This joke echoes one of the oldest paradoxes, the interiorization of external boundaries, or to borrow a concept from reception theory, reception theory, the inclusion of the excluded as part of a horizon of expectation. Necropolitics, I'd like to argue today, is an expansive temporal mode, or rather an understanding of spatial boundaries as temporal phenomena and a plea to overcome them. The narrative of Achille Mbembe's slim but dense book develops an alternative history protesting all forms of expansion, colonialist and national, capitalist and technological, a political philosophical rebellion against ethnic and territorial separation. It shifts every living form into a temporal argument against a Western life in stasis, or life in the form of anti-Blackness, anti-Semitism, and Islamophobia. As Mbembe puts it, that's the first quote here, for the question is no longer how to live life while awaiting the end. Instead, it is to know how living will be possible the day after the end, page 29 in Necropolitics. The end is, of course, the end of life as defined by enlightened humanism, itself a course of Judeo-Christian time, which, as Giorgio Agamben showed, places the current biopolitical state in what he calls the beginning of the end. Mbembe's time is rather a plea to jump off the visible wall and look at the asylum we call Western civilization from the perspective of the after or the outside. That is, as he explains it, the adopting or adapting the logic of racism to a global or even a planetary view, overcoming European traditions. In my short presentation today, I would like to focus on the chapter dedicated to the society of enmity, specifically its understanding of walls or separation and difference. The chapter halfway through the book presents us with the book's key theoretical and political principles. It develops a broadly Schmittian theory of conflict based on to a large degree on the example of the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and to what Mbembe calls the colonially settlers' own dependence on the second and third principles you see here on the slide, annihilation, anxiety, and fantasy of separation, page 46. Both principles, the negative anxiety and the positive fantasy, positive and negative, of course, in the Euro sense, fulfill a need for the fourth point, an immanent and immediate force, vital, visceral, and energetic, page 51. Mbembe does not specify his sources, but he's clearly theorizing here the careful work of modern political philosophical canon, including the one of Black studies, from Hegel and Marx, via Nietzsche, Du Bois, Heidegger, and Fanon, to Foucault and Agamben, next to the closer reading of Conditions in the Occupied Territories and Other Border Areas, a work done recently by political thinkers such as Wendy Brown, Stephen Graham, and Shalhoub Kevorkian, who just spoke before me, among others, or in Black Studies, Fred Moten, Saidiya Hartman, Frank Wildenstein, and Donna Jones, among others. If the scholarly course leads to a philosophical political analysis of life in Africa and the occupied territories, Mbembe opens the lens wide and far back into the past, into the history of colonialism, and further into the future or what comes after we transgress it. Consider that for Mbembe, the first point here, the Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories serves as a laboratory for a number of techniques of control, surveillance, and separation, pages 43, 44. From a different angle, consider how anxiety, which is past-oriented, and fantasy, a future expectation, turn the Schmittian separation between friend and foe, or Agamben's principle of sovereignty, into a contemporary political dynamic, i.e. the production of death in a large scale, necropolitics. The anxiety and fantasy of death, not life, becomes then the central political form because death, not life, demonstrates total and anti-democratic power. And of course, he builds here atop of what is known in Black studies as social death, or the social death of the after life of the slave, as a condition for thinking the impossibility of Black thinking, Black thought, Black theory. The dynamic temporal hermeneutics of the death drive, a Freudian principle Mbembe uses explicitly as a framework for the second point here, a drive for destruction that can be diverted toward the outside, page 121, allows him to view contemporary local and national politics in a global context. The blockade over Gaza and the destruction of the infrastructure alongside arbitrary humanitarian aid, again, Shalhoub Kevorkian wrote about that, for example. The Israeli measures, Mbembe shows, represent the underlying inclination of the security state, turning the occupation into a lab that reconfigures a long tradition of colonialist attack on the one hand, and shaping the global south by militarizing and weaponizing it, 156. Reshaping the past as a future colonialist utopia is grounded, much like Freud's death drive, on negating and suppressing the factual past of the racist state and turning it into a future-oriented fantasy of separation. This is the negative and the deadly dynamic of necropolitics. Having spoken so far about the negative, let me say a few words about the positive. There is an alternative in this book, and this is what Du Bois already in 1899 called the full stop of general humanity, i.e. the African, to which Mbembe adds also the Palestinian here. By stressing the centrality of temporal principles rather than static spatial ones, Necropolitics enables us a different view of past, present, and future conditions. Conditions of what he calls this stifling noonday, page 156. This is the title of Mbembe's sixth and final chapter in this book, and it connects a seemingly quick quote from Fanon's essay on African unity with the mentioned above philosophical canon. The image of noonday shows at the center, for instance, to give you just a few examples, of Nietzsche's Zarathustra, the first quote here, who ran and found no one else in noonday, in the stifling noonday, and relished his solitude and thought of good things for hours on end. It is time and overtime, he writes. As well as Heidegger's interpretation of Nietzsche and Rilke, or Paul Celan's own post-Holocaust response, the second quote here, midnight and midday and midnight, where one speaks of shadows, is where one speaks the truth. From Mbembe, this dialectics follows the dialectical relation developed by Fanon and James Baldwin's in Seasons, Baldwin, of course, in The Fire Next Time, that, the third quote here, concerning America, the Negroes are integral to the history of this new world, even if, in the Negro, as figure of the absolute outside, this world does not recognize its proper, page 157. Indeed, the African for the West or the Palestinian for the Israelis are quote unquote labs for what he recently called life futures or the alternative that I am, page 48. This is not an arbitrary connection, as Jonathan Al-Sheikh pointed out. In its resolution from August 1975, the Organization of African Unity noted the shared imperialist sources and legacy of colonialism in Palestine, South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Rhodesia. In the few minutes that remain, and I'm coming to my conclusion, I would like to return to the issue of dividing walls and temporal phenomena as temporal phenomena, what the French theoretician Jacques Rancière and the German thinker Joseph Vogel have called the interiorization of borders. This is also what I think Louise just referred to David Theo Goldberg, who calls it the interiorization of exclusion. Mbembe points out that interiorization cannot be dissociated from exteriorization in the context of necropolitics, and that the death drive that controls both movements is embedded in a vital, again, visceral and energetic force of spatial expansion. As a theory of time, necropolitics allows us then to follow the society of enmity as a universal as well as particular current forms of life. Necropolitics is at once the ruling principle that governs the present slave condition of current economies, as well as the specific form of governmentality that controls the oppression of minorities. Erecting walls, Mbembe writes, is an attempt to disrupt movement, erupt the flow of life or the excess, as he calls that, of presence, page 43. The excess of presence of the Black or the Palestinian, of course. It expresses the deepest desire to separate oneself from a type, quote unquote, an African in South Africa or the Palestinian in Gaza and the West Bank. But the walls, apparent phenomena in space, function as a dynamic form that signifies the suspense of movement, i.e. time, more than a positive shape in space. The wall allows a colonizing force to suppress and exclude the bad object, or the first quote here, veiled face, which is an explicit reference to Du Bois, the simulacrum of a face, page 49, unless it is placed under permanent surveillance that turns the face into an algorithm. Either way, the other is quantified, excluded, and marked. I wrote about that in the context of biometrics. Such practices stand in direct conflict with Article 13 of the United Nations in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. That's the second quote here. Everyone has the right to freedom of movement and residence within the borders of each state. Amal Jamal and Ariel Hendel wrote beautifully about how that functions within the occupied territories in the Gaza Strip. In a lecture he gave last year, and I'm coming to my conclusion, Mbembe expanded the notion of movement in life, identifying the post-45 understanding of life with a fast-changing world. In this lecture, and I'll conclude with this, he argues we should move a step beyond Foucault's biopolitics and biopower. While keeping in mind Africa and Palestine as labs for extreme forms of life, he concludes, and that's the last quote, it's a fact that unprecedented number of human beings are today embedded in complex structures that are increasingly intervening in the dynamics on a planetary scale. Such interventions led to the transgression of planetary boundaries, the anthropogenic climate change, generative land use change, biodiversity loss, etc. The new task of reason is to accompany and release a dimension that is speculative, what one would call cosmic imagination, and as we saw here in the stifling noonday. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Nitzan. Again, questions at the end. I invite people to prepare those questions on the chat. Without further ado, I'd like to ask Bruce Stanley, to share with us his presentation, Policing Palestinian Cities. Thanks.
Thank you, Louise. Thank you. I'm glad to be joining this online symposium today from London, where I'm an adjunct professor at Richmond University. Special thank you to Maha Kupti for her research support for this presentation. It is part of a larger investigation into platform policing across the MENA region. And thank you to the organizers of the symposium. Achille Mbembe argues that there is a new constellations of power at work in the world here at the beginning of this century. Evidence especially in the brutality of democracies and their sovereign war machines. This is a time of transitions, with political orders reconstituting themselves by deploying worlded global processes, crafting a nocturnal body, state of exception, through high-tech regimes of separation, which imprecate capital, digital technologies, and war. These new technologies, these new spatial temporal geographies of carcerality are assembled from component parts, which ceaselessly evolve to control human life in general. My research looks in particular at the mechanism of policing as the way necropolitics manifests itself in the everyday, how necropolitics emerges and is crafted. This is in line with Charles Tilley's argument about unraveling the mechanisms of emergence of social order, and with that of Jacques Rancière and his conceptualization of policing as a political partitioning of the community into those who count and take part and those who are excluded, with policing intended to prevent the true subject of politics from making their appearance. Mbembe's suggestions lead me to adopt the concept of the war police assemblage, a la Bachman's 2015 work, and drawing on Manuel de Landa's writing on assemblages. This assemblage is a contingent whole, made up of separate components which assemble together spatio-temporally to have causal powers of social control. Made up of diverse material and ideational parts, human and non-human, which entangle and must be bounded, maintained, and supported daily to retain its emergent properties. This war police assemblage manifests as carceral agents, technology, and socio-technical imaginaries, which together create carceral spaces and carceral processes in the everyday. Mbembe's work directs us to look at the spaces where big data with high-speed processes and algorithmic computation and mass surveillance operate for social control. And he identifies Palestinian cities as the site par excellence, where controls and guarantees of judicial order can be suspended, the zone where the violence of the state of exception is deemed to operate. Foucault made a similar point that when he said to police and to urbanize are the same thing. Today, the Palestinian city experience of necropolitics is coeval with and deeply entangled with policing trends of urban spaces around the world, and what Stan Cohen calls the hard machine controlling the urban. We don't have the time to go into detail on the range of urban carceral spaces created by the war police assemblage. Critical carceral geography encourages us, however, to look beyond the formal structures of prison and look also for any spaces where freedom is denied and certain behaviors curtailed within the Palestinian carceral city. This has led me to seek policing practices beyond traditional prisons and control of public spaces. It also involving ad hoc curfews, neighborhood lockdowns, extrajudicial sites, privatized public spaces, mobility controls, the carceral churn experienced by many, and what happens in the back of jeeps and vans between capture, arrest, lockup, and release. And thanks to Nadira's presentation, also in the freezers, in the mortuaries. As have others, I began to enumerate the range of government institutions, individuals, police units, private Israeli companies, investors, transboundary actors, types of actors who all labor to control the Palestinian city. Frankly, this here is a short and incomplete list. This is clearly a war police assemblage, with global networks, roles, and resources materializing in the local carceral city. The revolving door among military, police, capital, startups, and outside actors is incredible, leading to the conclusion that there is no national border to this assemblage as it confines Palestinian space and bodies. Of particular interest is the appearance of Chinese investment in Israeli carceral companies and the use of Huawei technology in the surveillance infrastructures, facilitating their expansion and deepening. Also interesting to note is the expansion of global private security companies into Palestinian spaces, the close relationship among the FBI, Interpol, and the Israeli police, and the facilitating role of academia in the war police machine. Much of the maintenance of the assemblage occurs through networks of delegation visits, joint training programs, and convention and trade show participation. Also, global police federations support Israeli police to empower their practices and finances. An interesting finding to me was the new facial recognition software offered by Coresight AI, which attracted $5 million of investment this April so that they can read mask-covered faces. It already holds 200 patents for fighting terror and policing citizens. The news this morning that tens of thousands of phones garnered from detained suspects have been gleaned for their contact data, which contributes to an ever-expanding database of potential violators, fits into this pattern of collecting any type of data for future data mining. Mbembe also warns us to look at the socio-technical imaginaries which contain a nocturnal body, an imaginary of separation and social control, which permeate and craft the carceral city as well. Here is where a worlded melange of discourse and millennial dreams of controlling the rebellious and chaotic city are deployed to frame the war police assemblage. The power of the city without violence, or the safe city urban imaginary, manifest in the combined work of many Israeli private and public actors, perhaps as represented by Mabat 2000, represents this fascination with achieving a city emptied of threat and risk, presented by the infection of the enemy within, all in real time, guided by networked AI to produce actionable intelligence. I agree with Mbembe that there is a new form of social control at work in the world cities, that of platform policing and carceral capitalism laboring in tandem. What used to be known as predictive policing has given way to a more expansive, capitalist-driven, real-time form of platform policing. And this has significant consequences for Palestinian cities. Mbembe identifies a number of characteristics of this transformation into a new form of necropolitics. The commodification of real-time data, the central role of carceral capitalism, policing implicated in which real citizens police their own city from the enemy within. The local is globalized and assembled, and the socio-technical imaginary is powerful and millennial. I've collected information on two Palestinian carceral cities, Nazareth and Jaffa, looking for evidence of the war police assemblage at work through platform policing in these particular cases. Many researchers have identified aspects of general Israeli policing in Palestinian spaces and bodies. I went looking for specific indicators of Mbembe's suggestions of a new emergent regime of separation at work in the everyday of these two spaces. Nazareth has been a testbed for various national policing projects and schemes and experiences an extensive form of platform policing. The differences between Nazareth elites, mechanisms of policing, and the war police assemblage for Nazareth are stark, as are the failure of police since the War Commission to end police impunity. Jaffa as well has a long history of policing, resistance, and decimation. Recent use of excessive force, clear subjugation of Palestinian space and bodies, particularly when it comes to erasing identity and enforcing COVID control through violence. Such episodes reaffirm Mbembe's arguments about necropolitics.
Can I ask you to draw to a close, please, Bruce?
Yes.
Thank you.
I found significant support for Mbembe's notions of transition. Platform policing and carceral capitalism are in evidence and working together. The socio-technical imaginary is extremely important and clearly in evidence. There remains resistance to necropolitics, demonstrating innovation and creativity, and platform policing empowers obscurity, lack of transparency, and no accountability. When comparing my findings with a study I've done on the Gulf carceral city, these two conurbations share approaches and framing, and now their ties as a single carceral city can be analyzed and are far advanced in this transition. In sum, the power of necropolitics as a theology of the future city producing a state of exception for Palestinian spaces and bodies is in evidence. And Mbembe warns us that the state of the Palestinian carceral city gives us a glimpse into a global future, and there is much evidence of this. His call to shift global politics to an all-world politics based on the universal right to breathe needs to be heeded. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would like to suggest that we take 20 minutes for questions so that we have a 10-minute break starting at 10 to 9 in order for ourselves to reassemble ourselves for the next session, which will begin at 9 o'clock with Greenwich Mean Time +3, in other words. So we have a good space of 20 minutes, and I would like to invite responses to the panel that we've just heard. I think in fascinating ways, we've already seen various sets of interactions in the sense that temporalities have been opened up, not only as a kind of theoretical vista in the work of Nitzan, but there has been an opening in the work of Madar of the temporality surrounding death itself, a prolongation of a kind of state of life in death, a different aspect perhaps of the thingness that Achille Mbembe reads through Fanon, for instance. That's one set of interacting axes here. And then, of course, Bruce, you yourself referenced how the state freezer, right, is incorporated into these formal and informal sites of ongoing carcerality. And so there again, we have an interesting opportunity for cross-referencing the various contributions that are coalescing here. My very grateful thanks to all panelists and to all members of the audience who bore with us through initial technical teething difficulties. Everybody, I think, could do with a cup of coffee, tea, water, whatever, and we will reconvene in 10 minutes at 9 o'clock for the session entitled Body and Affect, which will be chaired by Matan Kaminer. Thank you all so much.
All right, everyone, let's get going. For the second half of our first day of this very jam-packed conference. My name is Matan Kaminer. I'm a postdoctoral fellow currently transitioning from the University of Haifa to the Hebrew University, the Buber Center there. And I'm an anthropologist and I'm a member of the board at Academia for Equality. So I just want to welcome all of you who haven't heard or didn't know of our organization before. We're very happy to have you. We're very honored to be hosting this conference and in honor of the work of Achille Mbembe. And we're really excited for the rest of the talks that are coming up. I won't blather on too much. I just want to introduce our two next speakers. I've had to shorten your bios a little bit because of the lack of time. We'll use the same format as we used before. So the two of them will speak one after the other. Then we'll take some questions from the audience, questions or comments, and then we'll have time for response from both speakers before we wrap things up for today. We should be done by 10 o'clock Jerusalem time. Okay, so I'm very happy to be presenting to you Nitzan Tal, who is a PhD candidate in the Department of Comparative Literature at Cornell University. She's currently working on a project interrogating contemporary Hebrew and South African novels for their treatment of culpability and complicity. She's also co-authored a recent article with Louise Bethlehem, who you've met, and has a forthcoming chapter in Settler Colonial Food Cultures, edited by Ronald Branta, Daniel Motorescu, and Alex Colas. She will be speaking on vertical geography, circular affect, necropolitics creates its sovereign. And we'll just introduce the next speaker after her in order to speed things along. He is Michael Zalta, a queer Syrian-American writer and researcher interested in the intersections between media theory, biopolitics, and decolonial aesthetics. He's a graduate of NYU's Gallatin School of Individualized Study, where he created a concentration examining differential forms of invisibility and the intangible violence produced by the Israeli occupation of Palestine. He's a former researcher with forensic architecture and an incoming master's student at Goldsmiths University. He will be speaking on the elasticity of death, necrological sentience, and the misapprehension of the maimed Palestinian resistance fighter. And without further ado, I'm turning the mic over to Nitzan.
Thanks, Matan. How do I do this? Okay. So I hope everyone saw my link. It's not necessary to see the quotes. It's just I have them. The ones that I will be saying in English are there in Hebrew for everyone who might translate. I don't stand behind any of the translations. They're not my, you know, I'm not the translator for this text. Okay. Bonnie Brodetsky's An Almost Olympic-Sized Pool, Rechakim at Olymp, is the story of a seaside Jewish town in the Western Galilee. The narrative starts with a young woman from the town killing a man from the neighboring Arab town. It then spans almost 20 years of the Jewish town's history, during which ever more disturbing occurrences befall its inhabitants. Meanwhile, refuse from an asbestos factory, which was the lifeblood of the town's economy, emanates upwards from its burial dumps, wreaking havoc on the townspeople's bodies at the cellular level. Oz Shelach's picnic grounds, originally in English, is a collection of microfictions which weave through the stories of Jewish Israeli characters in and around Jerusalem to trace, in Amiel Alkalai's words on the jacket, a quote, archaeology of complicity and denial, end quote. The metropolitan setting, and yeah, if you come from the Galilee, Jerusalem is a metropolis, sits atop an infamous past. The text is sensitive to the surface depth relations between the Russian compounds, pubs, and its interrogation cellars, Givat Shaul's picnic grounds atop the ruins of Deir Yassin. Time allowing, I'll argue two claims today. The first is that both Bodetsky and Shelach draw a vertical geography that expands Mbembe's claims about the vertical sovereignty model of the occupied West Bank and Gaza. The second is that this surface depth relationship, as formulated in these political works of fiction, animates an affective mechanism, rather like the interlocking gears connecting linear to rotational motion. And that doing so, they theorize an affective infrastructure of complicity coextensive with the geographical one. Mbembe defines the necropolitical aspects of Palestine-Israel through Eyal Weizman's idea of the politics of verticality. Under colonialism, Mbembe tells us, space is, quote, the raw material of sovereignty, end quote. In Palestine-Israel, the fragmentation, ruination, and surveillance of space, sorry, there's a truck, uniquely extends along a Y-axis, from satellite surveillance to drone and helicopter bombings through ground level bulldozing to underground excavation. And this is Eyal Weizman's work through Mbembe's sort of retelling. This characterization, characterization typifies sovereignty in the West Bank and Gaza. I'd like to take a look at how Shelach and Bodetsky attend to vertical geography in their fiction. Verticality in Shelach starts with the eponymous picnic grounds, quote 1 in the handout. Quote, a professor of history from Beit Vagan took his family for a picnic in a quiet pine wood near Givat Shaul, formerly known as Deir Yassin. Listening carefully, they heard a faint, low hum from the curves of the winding highways hidden from view by the trees. The professor did not talk of the village origin of the stones. He imagined that he and his family were having a picnic unrelated to the village, enjoying its grounds outside history. Deir Yassin was a Palestinian village, etched in memory for the especially violent attack Zionist forces waged on it in April of 1948, now widely known as the Deir Yassin massacre. In this passage, a professor of history uses stones left over from the ruined village to build a fire with his son, the site of the village having been replaced with an idyllic scene of leisure. As Abdelrahim el-Sheikh describes, the pine forests of the JNF are central to Shelach's criticism of Israel's geography. Later, the text will declare, quote, all along the road to Jerusalem, we planted over the past, end quote. But the vertical axis thrums powerfully through Shelach's urban scenes as well. Consider the following microfiction, which I'll try to read in its entirety, and it's quote 2. The proprietor of a bar in the Russian compound received complaints from patrons about the sounds that filtered into the bar at night and tainted the drinking pleasure. He sent numerous letters to the police pointing out that these unsettling voices, as he called them, came from the jail across the street, traveling from the interrogation rooms deep under the police station, 4, some said 6 floors underground, all the way up to his bar on the street level. I'm jumping a little bit. Finally, the bar owner had no choice but to increase the volume of the music playing in his bar during quieter hours. His hearing deteriorated. The violent activity of the interrogation cells underground has a double, almost paradoxical effect on the bar. Its undergroundness disavows all Palestinian presence, which maintains the sense of carefree inebriation on the surface. But the police's intervention underground is also the crucial foundation on which the bar's sense of normalcy rests. In Bodetsky, when Yusuf, an Arab teacher whose parents were expelled from their village in 1948, is found dead in his burned car on the side of the road. He's buried in the nearby Jewish town's new cemetery. His mother's lament, broadcast in the evening news, ties Yusuf's burial back to the village that once was. And this is quote 3. The voice here is the voice of the newscaster. Quote, the government has consented to Yusuf's burial in the new cemetery where his mother, Mbembe, claims their village Jabasia used to be. How tall were the houses in Jabasia, and such oranges, and the chickens, and the breeze of Jabasia. Yes, thank you, Mbembe, for speaking with us. Very sorry for your loss. End quote. Jabasia of the Jabasia cemetery in the quote above is a real Palestinian village, Al-Jabasia, in the Acre subdistrict of Ottoman and Mandatory Palestine. During the 1948 war, the village was occupied by Israeli forces and its inhabitants expelled. And as in the book, the current cemetery of nearby Jewish town Haria was inaugurated on the village's land in 2002. Importantly, the meaning of Yusuf's burial place in this cemetery atop a ruined Palestinian village is contested in his mother's town. Wagging tongues deliberate between the meaning on the ground surface and the historical significance of the buried past. Quote, Mbembe buried her child in Jabasia, they said in the town to the east. Others said, Mbembe buried her child like a Jew. She's ashamed of our cemeteries, end quote. While surface depth relations are spelled out in Shelach's English prose, Wodecki's Hebrew narration has its reader gathering the traces of past violence left in the text, traces which the collective narrating voice never acknowledges. As asbestos coming from below ground slowly kills the townspeople, they dig to bury the dead in the Jabasia cemetery. The following quote, which is quote 4, is a burial scene for the wife of Tzvi, a town dignitary, dead from cancer. And I'll just read his sort of musings about the ground. Tzvi looked at the ground, wet from yesterday's rain, looked at the beautiful view of the beach and the limestone cliffs and the northern border, and thought, the ground is a beautiful and pleasant place, and his Geula will be happy in the depths of nature. Tzvi observes his surroundings carefully, but Jabasia, the border, and the poisoned ground bring him comfort rather than political conflict, violent ruination, or dangerous pollution. Geula will be happy in the depths of nature, he says. That term is itself aberrant, ma'amakei hateva. Nature, usually thought of laterally as an expanse, is harnessed to the surface depth model occasioned by the text. Ironic distance takes center stage when Tzvi watches the tiny grains of sand stuck to his hand. Such small things can give such comfort, he says, while the reader is perhaps moved to shake the poisonous particles away from her own hand. Thus, thank you. Thus, a slow violence, barely acknowledged and yet powerfully sensed, emanates from the remnants of the village and of the asbestos, alike permeating the town's inhabitants. The surface depth relationship, Shelach's woods and pubs, Wodecki's asbestos and cemetery, expand Mbembe and Weizmann's theorization of the necropolitical division of the West Bank and Gaza. First, by including the Nakba as this originary point of violence in 1948, but then they also follow the infrastructure of highways, parks, and walls with the affective implications of these vertical axes. The usual way of thinking spatial relations, spatial with an A, relations, means that their territory and our territory are visible, and that each place is one or the other in a zero-sum game. Vertical geography opens up the possibility for a place to be occupied by more than one entity at once. Metaphorically, the vertical axis allows the so-called us on the surface to deny the existence of a continuing violent control over whom I don't see anyone, while making that violent control and the traces it left behind fundamental in the physical sense of that us. Of course, this possibility of more than one territory existing at once is also a fear, for even if we are here now, they might still be with us, under us. Both texts employ what Rebecca Fassel terms we narration, reflecting and commenting on a collective consciousness and structure of feeling which undergirds it that respond to this fear. I probably have like 30 seconds left. I'm gonna try getting to the rest of it. Which brings me to the second part of my argument. The texts tie the physical politics of verticality to a process of perception and affect which govern what characters see or do not see, feel, or are desensitized to. This process is one of habitual recognition and disavowal, and I'm gonna skip some of the examples that I meant to give here and just point you back to quote 4 with Zvi looking at the ground, looking at the beautiful view, right? And the Hebrew word is hitbonen, which is particular to sort of a careful watching, yet he sees none of the traces of violence on the landscape. And then again, going back to the quotes I pulled from Shelach, this auditory sensing and unsensing abound, right? The professor's attentiveness is juxtaposed with what he doesn't sense. Listening carefully, they heard a faint low hum from the curves of the winding highways, hidden from view by the trees. But while the highway can be heard through, though it is hidden by the trees, other things that are hidden by the trees, like the remnants of Dir Yassin and the family's implication in its history, remain insensible. The bar proprietor from the Russian compound loses his hearing as he had no choice, quote, but to increase the volume of the music, end quote, to drown out prisoners' voices. But it is not the individual moments of failed or selective perception that hint at a circular affective structure. Rather, it's the structure of both Shelach and Bodetsky's texts which emphasize repetition and cyclicality. In Bodetsky, each chapter speeds towards an abrupt, usually violent ending. Then the narrative picks up anew in a series of stops and starts. In Shelach, some micro-stories begin and end with the same sentence, and I'm getting to my final words. Some microfictions begin and end with the same sentence. Many repeat themes and objects, telling and retelling a Jewish-Israeli existence determined by the haunting of Palestinian life. Hanan Hever famously claimed that the need to overcome the Palestinian other has paradoxically necessitated the presence of Palestinians in canonical Zionist Hebrew literature. The texts I discussed today foreground the fact that a collective consciousness built on erasure and self-narration built on the same cannot afford that erasure's completion. The collective, which narrates Bodetsky and Shelach's books, is cyclically erasing and calling forth the Palestinian life that they are complicit in disallowing. Complicity itself, the texts suggest, creates a structure of feeling of cyclical denial and obsession, which emanates from, as well as necessitates, the vertical, coextensive relationship between over and underground. Thank you.
Thank you, Nitzan. We'll be moving right along now to our next speaker, Michael Zalta. The stage is yours.
Great. I'm just going to quickly share my screen. Great. And you should be able to hear and see me at the same time, I hope. Okay. In 2018, photographer Mahmoud Hams won the Bayeux Calvados Normandy Award for War Correspondence for this photograph of Sabbagh al-Ashkar, a bilateral amputee who was photographed while protesting during the Great March of Return. In May of 2018, he was reported to have been killed by Israeli snipers. However, it was soon discovered that al-Ashkar was mistaken for another amputee, Fadi Abu Salah, who was maimed by the IDF in 2008 and killed while participating in the 2018 protests. A BuzzFeed article clarified for a social media savvy public that the photo was indeed al-Ashkar Abu Salah, revealing what I see as a troubling tension: how the maimed Palestinian is celebrated in his survival yet misidentified and confused in his death. case is but one example of the very questionable terms of recognition afforded by those Palestinians exhibiting an array of political injuries, who've garnered an increased amount of attention in the past several years since activists and scholars worldwide have come to further incorporate disability justice and intersectional solidarity efforts against state violence. Points to striking images of Palestinian death and martyrdom that have long mobilized activists in the Palestinian liberation struggle. These photos frame the supreme will for survival by Palestinians in the face of relentlessly debilitating violence. Published in major news publications like The Independent, The New York Times, Al Jazeera, Hyperallergic, in addition to being shared on media, coverage of these maimed resistance fighters typically look the same. They glorify and amplify the calls for justice uttered from this uniquely precarious subject position. The widespread sharing of such photos amongst activists and scholars between Palestine and the West has led to a particular lionization of maimed Palestinian resistance fighters as figures that epitomize the Palestinian struggle for survival. Or as Nick Mirzoff comments, quote, "These photographs depict the full ways in which the regime's claim Palestinians does not destroy them," end quote. In light of the sort of recognition these photos have received, I'm particularly interested in questioning whether such attempts to represent spectacularize Palestinian resistance as such has come to replace, if not counteract, more familiar depictions of Palestinian martyrdom, and if so, to what effect? And we may know many scholars have long called attention to the ways in which the visual presentation of one's political injury can function as a springboard for action and protest, implying even in some cases that the Palestinian political resistance is to risk one's life in bids for recognition of one's suffering as a universal index of a shared humanity. However, when you return to photo, you get the sense that it's not just an appeal for liberal human recognition, nor even just a struggle for survival, but rather a superhuman capacity for resistance that is informed and glorified in these shots. Such framings leave one to question who these photos might eclipse, and what sort of qualifications might govern who, in their debilitation, is rendered legible and human within international eyes. As we may know, nearly 100,000 people in Gaza and the West Bank are disabled, yet only a handful ever in shots like these. Moreover, such photos seem to uphold ableist contours of more familiar forms of Palestinian political resistance, as we see, here, potentially at the expense of preventing emergent strategies of resistance to be legible under international eyes. Along these lines, I suggest that celebrating these photos as an index of Palestinian resistance par excellence runs the risk of reestablishing liberal humanism's authority to uphold particular forms of capacitation to find what is and what might seem to qualified life. This is problematic not only because it ignores the modes of living practiced by those disabled and maimed Palestinians who fail to materialize in these shots, but moreover because it forecloses any alternative instantiations of the human or of Palestinian futurity that might be exhibited by maimed Palestinians in their attenuated ways of living. Having established some of the issues, the rest of my presentation will look to Achille Mbembe's writing to think more cogently about the political of Palestinians and how the maimed body beneath and about the maimed body beneath necropolitical systems of governance. Building upon his critiques of martyrdom, I intend to demonstrate ways in which the conception of their body might open up avenues to better understand the affective and agential capacities embedded within this ontology of maimed being, which in turn might provide us new ways to read this image set, not only as reflecting a superhuman will for survival, but moreover a powerful demand for Palestinian futurity beyond the contours of the fully capacitated political subject.
Michael?
However, before I look to Mbembe, it's worth briefly contextualizing. Yep. Yeah.
You're a bit choppy, so people, might I suggest that maybe you turn your camera off so at least we can hear you better?
Yes.
Thank you.
Can you hear me better?
Right now it's actually worse, but let's hope maybe it'll get better in a few seconds.
Okay. So before I look to Mbembe, I'd like to briefly contextualize these photographs within what Jasbir Puar recently called the right to maim. In her 2017 book, Puar demonstrates how Israel's shoot to cripple military policy and differential management of Palestinian and Israeli mobility constitute Israel's implicit claiming of the right to maim Palestinians as opposed to killing them, in targeting, quote, not life itself, but resistance itself, and quote, it effectively sealed its murderous impulse, keeping civilian death tolls low while imbricating maimed Palestinians into Israeli rehabilitative care. Effectively, her formulation ossifies the political and physical existence of the maimed individual as a non-agentic, inhuman surface, ripe for state intervention. This is problematic because in under-theorizing the ontology of maimed subjects, she fails to envision the maimed as ever possessing any form of political agency beyond such squandered attempts to mimic ableist forms of resistance that we might see in these photographs. To think more closely then about the potentialities of the main body, I now turn to Achille Mbembe, who in articulating his theories of necropolitical sovereignty also thinks about modalities of resistance to the forms of, quote, death in life, which he argues necropower produces. In doing a bit of a close reading of his conception of martyrdom, I intend to demonstrate what I find both useful and restrictive for imagining the ontology of main being. In discussing what he eventually comes to see as the futility of martyrdom as a mode of resisting necropower, Mbembe posits that the logic of martyrdom produces a, quote, new semiosis of killing, wherein the body is abstracted or weaponized in order to, quote, labor under the sign of future. The symbolic reclamation of one's personal sovereignty through martyrdom, then, is but a temporal reconfiguration of an already imminent death. As Mbembe explains, quote, death, the future, collapsed into the present. Through this logic, death signifies a sort of finality for the body, a spatially temporally fixed barrier between the here and now of what Mbembe names death in life and the eternity, perhaps, of a life in death. But in returning to the ontology and embodiment of the maimed, a form of living attenuated by injury and the amputation of dead bodily matter, one wonders how their laboring under the sign of the future might unfix this spatial temporal designation of death. Further reviewing the process of political suicide, Mbembe explains, in its eternity, the besieged passes through two stages. First, it is transformed into a mere thing, malleable matter. Second, the matter in which it is put to death, suicide, affords it ultimate cessation. Effectively, he explains, quote, the body duplicates itself, and in death, literally and metaphorically, escapes the state of siege and occupation. Speaking in this paradoxical language of a death-driven yet passively besieged body that actively desires to be put to death implies that suicide is an involuntary fait accompli, not an act of political resistance. The duplication of the body in death implies that a new semiosis of killing requires a complete reinsertion in death, in its fully emboweled form, or as he describes it, in the uniform of the martyr, end quote. His semiotics of killing thus reads as lexically indebted to a narrow rubric for political animacy determined by the fixity of the body as being alive or dead, a fixity which I argue a more polymorphic understanding of maimed ontology might disrupt. Effectively, his notion of martyrdom, while acknowledging a certain affective expression, the body's desire for futurity, misses what scholars within Black studies and new materialist studies have seen as the potentiality already inscribed within the body's malleable matter, or in the words of Alexandre Wahelier, the flesh, which is not an abject zone of exclusion that culminates in death, but rather an alternate instantiation of humanity that does not rest on the mirage of Western man as the mirror image of human life as such, end quote. An effort to conduct a better reading of the potentiality of maimed being requires then that one not read the semiotic codes produced by the body when inscribed within death, but those inscribed upon the malleable, vivisectable, amputatable flesh, perhaps those matters of the maimed body. This reading hinges upon the way in which Mbembe's reading of the living yet already dead's body's affectivity carves the inroads to the forms of freedom and futurity he describes yet decries. This affectivity, the abstracted body's desire for eternity, is at the root of what I'm still seeking to describe as the maimed subject's necrosentience, a term which characterizes the maimed subject's affective relationship to his or her own dead matter and the affectivity of one's being or living within death, that is, as socially dead or as politically and physically dismembered. Necrosentience in my formulation is a key component within a larger conglomeration of maimed being, which calls for a reimagination of the maimed body and its potential to penetrate and effectively erode the boundaries carved between present and future, presence and absence, civil society and the frontiers of Israel's necropolitical laboratory, effectively the checkpoints between life and death. For the sake of time and because I am sharing analysis on several visual works by Palestinian artists that demonstrate this notion of necrosentience, I'd like to finish off my presentation by extending my inquiry into the ways in which the necropolitical body materializes in Mbembe's writing, and ask, how might a reinterpolation of the necropolitical body as maimed disrupt what Mbembe sees as its putative uniformity? Might there exist modalities of being that are not governed by the fixed temporality and fully embodied materiality of life or death? In other words, are there liberatory modes of self-reflexively elasticizing one's own death that allows one to avoid becoming malleable matter in the hands of the state or sovereign? How then might pivoting our attention away from the extraordinary humanity and bodily capacity exhibited by the subject of our photos force us to reorient towards an exhibition of the maimed individual's bodily or ontological lack, their amputated limbs that are fossilized, disappeared, and scattered across the Israeli-Palestinian landscape? Might these fragmentary traces of the body illuminate an ever-present yet unspeakable absence in our political imaginaries, an affective desire for the possibility for another world, for Palestinian futurity, or for the regeneration of the Palestinian landscape? To these ends, I leave you now with the last verse of Mahmoud Darwish's poem, "The Earth is Closing In on Us." Quote, "We will cut off the hand to the song to be finished by our flesh. We will die here, here in the last passage, here, and here our blood will plant its olive tree."
Thank you, Michael. And thank you, Nitzan, for both of those very, very spatial presentations. I feel like we've been opened up to the vertical dimension and everything that's above and below us, both metaphorically and as well as very concretely. So we'll be back tomorrow. We have a very full program of exciting talks, and hopefully there won't be any technical issues, although I think we managed to keep most of them behind the scenes. So tomorrow will be even more relaxed and have more fun working together on these not always very fun issues, but very important ones. So thank you, everyone. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming. Please note that we have a different link for tomorrow's meeting. It's been sent to by email to everyone who registered, but if you have any sort of technical issues, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us. The email address is concerningpalestineisrael@gmail.com. And there's also many other ways to get in touch with us if you need us. So we'll see you tomorrow. Thank you very much. Good night. Good day, wherever you are.
Yeah.